Um, I was recently asked to be in a invitational tournament on chess.com by a chap called Mark. His handle on chess.com is Fangbo, and it was really kind of him to ask me to be involved in this tournament. It was a bunch of strong, interesting, diverse players. The game we're going to flip through now is a game I played against Nick Burrows, who goes to my chess club and is a much better player than me, and he's got loads of interesting ideas. He's a really good player. Anyway, so I'm just going to go through it pretty quickly and just give you my impressions and some of the interesting things that happened. So he played knight f3. So this is a great way to start the game. We're trying to do three things in the opening. We're trying to control the centre squares, so his knight is attacking some of those central squares. We're trying to get the pieces out of the way so the king can castle into safety, probably, not always, but probably. And we're just trying to develop the pieces, actually. So job 1 is develop the pieces, which it does. Job 2 is control the centre squares. Job 3 is to get castled. I looked at this, and of course I could bring my knight out as well, which is correct. Nothing wrong with that. But I just thought, well, why don't we bring out the queen's pawn? You can't bring out the king's pawn because it'll take it. Why don't I bring out the queen's pawn to create a position which is asymmetric? So we're not just copying. I mean, there's nothing wrong with copying, but this time we're not. He moves his pawn forward. The idea here, almost always, is to put the bishop behind the pawn, and then he's castling behind that bishop and the knight. This is called a fianchetto. It's a good move. I, in my quest for doing something different, moved my queen's bishop's pawn forward, pawn to c5. So this is sort of, I'm playing a white system in reverse here. So often white would play these two moves and then black would play the way that white's playing. So we're slightly swapping roles. So I'm trying to really gain control of the centre. I'm going to bring out my knight, and then perhaps my knight is going to support the advance of my king's pawn. So I can claim a lot of space in the centre, but there's no right or wrong. This is just different strategies. Nick brings out his bishop as predicted, and that's got to be a really good move. It's got to be a right move. I could bring out my... It's probably better right now to bring out my queen's knight, actually. But I decided to bring out my king's knight. It's a little bit safer. Frankly, there's not a lot of difference between the two moves. But perhaps it's more flexible to bring out the queen's knight. I think what I was worried about, actually, was him bringing out his queen's pawn 2 squares and playing a reverse Grunfeld defence. And so I didn't really want to let that happen early in the game. So bring out my king's knight. Nick castles. Again, just can't argue with that move. Now I do bring out my queen's knight. Maybe I just say... Because you see, what I want him to play is pawn to d3, moving his queen's pawn 1 square forward. And then I play pawn to e5, and I've got a centre, and we've got an interesting unbalanced game. What I'm worried about him playing is pawn to d4, that move. Because now he's got a version of the Grunfeld defence reversed. And the Grunfeld defence is really good for black. And with an extra tempo, it's probably a lot better. So now I'm pretty worried. And I play pawn to e6, which I think is a conservative move. It's a kind of safe move. I mean, the really risky thing would be to take that pawn off on d4. And then you're sort of playing the main line of the Grunfeld reversed. And I just thought, let's play safe and solid. e6, now you're defending the c-pawn if he takes it. It's not that ambitious, but against such a good player, to play really ambitiously at this point feels frightening. Well, not frightening, but perhaps just a mistake. Nick, very good move, pawn to c4. So now I'm claiming this is sort of like a Catalan. He's playing the white side of a Catalan. And I think black is playing, to be honest, not the way I would want to play the Catalan. So I'm now a bit unhappy about what I've gotten myself into. So if you're unhappy, just, console yourself by chopping off a pawn. So I took this pawn on c4. Well, it looks a bit ugly. He moved out his queen. This is a good move. So this is attacking the pawn that's just taken on c4. But it's also indirectly causing other problems because it's pinning the knight against the queen, against the king. And so there's a threat that his knight will now attack my knight, with the bishop also attacking my knight, and create some kind of a crisis, some kind of worries there. So I interpose my bishop to break the pin, and now I'm threatening to move my knight away, take the pawn, and attack his queen. So he chops off that free pawn. So we're equal on material again. And I play this move. Now, he really doesn't want to take that, because again, if my knight moves, I've got a disc of attack on his queen. So he runs back. And then I'm slightly pushing his queen around there. Just, attack the queen again with the pawn. At this point, I just put that rook on the open file on the understanding that at some point he may take the c pawn, and then you'd have a nice open file to have the rook on. It just seemed wise. So Nick takes. I can take back with the bishop. There's no real threat there. If we take a quick look at the position, it's fine. It's not a disaster. I suppose my worry is that my king's stuck in the centre. My pawn on the queen side is a bit over advanced, and actually the computers here do say white's a little bit better, and I understand that. He brings his bishop. He develops his knight to d2, which is really sensible. So it's defending its colleague, and there's all sorts of ways it can get into the game. Clearly, it couldn't have come out the other way because my pawn would have taken it. I take the opportunity to castle, which must be right. My king's been in the centre for too long. There's no direct threats to it, but it's time for it to go. Nick brings his knight out, attacking my bishop. Now, A, that bishop's just free at the moment, but B, I wouldn't want to swap it for the knight anyway. So I retreat to this square, which looks like a pretty decent square to me, actually. I quite like it, and already I'm dreaming of pushing that A pawn up the board and causing trouble. Nick brings his bishop out to challenge my bishop, which makes sense. It's a kind of nice bishop, and I don't want to swap yet. If he takes, I think I want to take back with the queen, and also I'm moving a pawn up and threatening to fork his knight and queen with my pawn. His knight runs away for that reason. I just give up and decide to swap off. I actually can't remember why I did that, but it doesn't look like a disaster. And then I'm moving my queen off the open file, so I'm moving it to a square where it's defending both pawns. I don't really want it on an open file because I think his rooks are going to come onto that open file, and also I want my own rooks. Basically, these rooks are like Ferraris. We don't want them in the garage, we want them on the open road. So we want them on these nice open files where they can either penetrate the opponent's position or cause other problems. Nick plays pawn here, probably because he doesn't want my knight coming around to bother his queen, which is in probably a slightly exposed position. I mean, I haven't asked him, but that's probably... Nick, if you want to write in the comments why you did that, just let me know. And then I think what I'm doing here is I'm taking the opportunity to double my rooks. So I'm hoping to put my king's rook onto c8 and create doubled rooks. He's putting his rooks on the open file too, where my queen used to be, so she's so glad she moved. I have doubled my rooks, so this makes me happy. So doubled rooks are always useful. I mean, they might get swapped off, but right now, even if he plays rook c1, maybe my knight could move and create problems for that rook. So already, actually, it's quite nice, those doubled rooks. Nick moves his knight to here. Now, actually, this is where the computers start to feel that black gets a bit better. So what's happening here is I'm going to take this knight, and then it's basically allowing my pawns to start pushing his queen and other pieces around in the centre of the board. So I take his queen's there. It's not a bad square for the queen, but on some level it feels a little bit exposed, perhaps. I'm playing my pawn up like this, and the basic idea is to say that knight is not going to have a stable square where it is. I don't want that knight to have an easy life. I don't want it to relax. I want the chance to push that knight to other squares which might give it problems. Nick brings his other rook to the open file, countering my doubled rooks. So right now, if my knight wasn't there, I couldn't take his rook because it's defended twice. So this is clever. He's sort of countering, But actually, this leads to problems down the line. Interestingly, this leads to problems down the line. I open my my castle king in my king's position. I move the pawn in front of my king. Now, part of this is to allow my bishop to move and attack the queen being defended by the pawn. And part of it is just to stop me getting mated, because at some points you can get mated on the back row. And because I've opened up a dark square, he hasn't got a dark square bishop, it feels less scary. I don't think he's going to get a kingside attack here, basically. He plays pawn to e3, not sure why, certainly not a bad move. Gives his bishop options, nothing wrong with it. So now, as promised, I'm attacking his queen with my bishop. And all of a sudden, the queen's got slightly fewer squares than it would like. It's not a disaster, but it's slightly short on squares. And actually, it goes to f3. And you could say, I don't know if you would say, you could say that this is the losing move. Because all of a sudden now, black has got some initiative and some ideas, but it's quite deeply hidden. The idea starts by attacking this knight, which we said we didn't want to have a safe space on b3, and actually it's got relatively few squares. It can go right back into the corner, but Nick chose to bravely advance it, which I think is probably the best move, here. Now, the basic concept, what black's trying to do here is to pin that knight against the rook. So, if I can move my knight away, then his knight is pinned against his rook. And when it moves away, I can take twice at the back. Now, there are versions of the world where his knight can move to a position where it defends the rook, for instance, to d3. So, I stop that by hitting his queen, so attacking his queen, and also stopping that knight get to the d3 square. Queen moves to f4, and now my knight's going to come back, and essentially his knight's pinned. Now, this wasn't the best move, by the way, by me. Actually, knight a5 is a much better move, but this is what I worked out, this is what I thought. But certainly, I mean, the core of the idea is that that knight is now pretty embarrassed. It's attacked 3 times, defended once, and if it moves, that rook at the back's going to drop. So what is Nick going to do? Well, what Nick does is he complicates things by now attacking my bishop with his pawn. So if I take his knight now, he'll take my rook, I'll take his rook, he'll take my bishop, we counter squits. So I'm going to move my bishop away. Now, he can't take that bishop with the knight. Well, he can, but he'll lose a rook at the back. So instead what he does is his queen picks up this free pawn which was left hanging. So what Nick's doing here very cleverly is complicating things, because if I just won a piece, even if I win a piece and he gets 2 pawns, it's really hard going for white, because basically black's going to win, and in a way it's sort of simple. You swap off, you're left with your extra piece, you win the pawns, you often end up winning the game. I'm aware that his pawn on a2 is undefended, so I've got my own chances here. But the first thing I do is just hack off this extra piece. I mean, it's a whole piece. So I take here. Nick takes the pawn, but also what he's doing is he's pinning the knight to the queen. And so if I just take his rook at the back, I'm losing my whole queen. But then I can take his other rook with check, defending my knight, which is defending my bishop. So I've got a coherent set of pieces here. And 2 rooks is worth slightly more than a queen. So this is probably worth doing. But all of a sudden we're into a very mixed sort of game, which is much harder to play. So I take his rook, he takes my queen, I take the other rook with check, he's going to move his king, and then I just move the rook back up, because I'm threatening double my rooks, my sideways moving experts, double my rooks on his 7th rank, and just kind of hoover up his pawns, hopefully his bishop, maybe his king. Just hoover up various stuff. And because the rook is defending the knight, which is defending the bishop, and because the king is pretty safe, I'm not overly worried. And certainly the computer at the moment says that I am better, doing better. His king moves to defend the pawn. It's very sensible. And then I do double rooks as threatened. And right now what I'm thinking of doing is taking off his queenside pawns, which kind of can't move because my pawn's in the way. He advances his pawns on the king's side. Now this is really clever, and it's a new development, because all of a sudden now I'm worried about him busting open my king's side. I'm worried about him attacking the king's side with his bishop, which will also attack my rook. If he moves his bishop to e4, that's going to attack my rook. And if he's got rid of those pawns, then his bishop and queen are going to cause absolute havoc. So now all of a sudden I'm really tense. So I'm moving my pawn here basically to allow me to lock the pawns if he starts advancing. He advances. I realise that locking doesn't work. I won't bore you with the details. The problem with locking now is he's going to push his other pawns, and all of a sudden all the pawns could come off and it could be absolute bedlam. And I don't want it to be bedlam because I've got my material advantage. I want to keep it. I want to keep my king safe. Now it might not look like the king is safe here because I've just opened up the pawns, but actually it's safer than it first appears because there's a few pieces around. It's quite hard to get at, and also those rooks do damage quite quickly at the back. He takes back. I move my king here for reasons I won't bore you with. This is a good move, obviously, and this is something we're looking out for. He moves his bishop out with tempo, attacking my rook. Now, I could have taken the pawn here. I can't remember why I didn't. I think because I quite like the idea of having that check. In a lot of variations, having that check behind the king is really, really useful. Nick, again, it's a really good move this. He's attacking my rook, which is awkward, and so I quickly give a check, and then when his king moves, I come back to defend that rook, which is defending the knight. And there's a general theme here, which is keeping these chains of pieces all defending each other. You know, it's sort of like people climbing up a mountain together and having a rope which ties them all together. You know, they're all sort of linked, so none of them drop off down the mountain. Nick moves his king here. Again, one of the reasons is just to defend a pawn. Just to defend that f-pawn is one of the reasons. But it's all quite complicated. I take the view that I'm trying to get the bishops off. Now, when you material up, it's better to have less material on the board because then it just counts more. And so I've decided to try and get the bishops off. I think if he doesn't swap, it's a bit of a horror show because my bishop's now covering some light squares around his king, and I think those rooks can really do him a mischief. So I think he's got to get the bishops off, really. I take back with a rook. And now the position is sort of clarified. I mean, we're coming to what I suppose you'd call an endgame. And the bottom line is, I've got these 3 pieces against his 1, but he's got a queen, which is the strongest piece in the game. Right now, the big risk for me is perpetual check. I do not want to let him. I mean, I want to win this game, right? I mean, we all want to win. And at the moment, I'm material up. I don't want to let him, like, check me all over the board in a perpetual check. The very last thing I want him to do is to fork 2 of my pieces and my king. Or fork my king and a loose piece. Now that's not going to happen right now because all my pieces are defending each other, but right now the risk really is perpetual check. Nick, again, a sort of ambitious and active player, just, I think, starts pushing his pawns, I think probably in the hope of inconveniencing my king or creating some attacks around my king where the pawns are covering the squares. The queen can come in and give the death blow. No one wants that. I attack his pawn, which I would take with check at the moment. He defends it. I hoover off this pawn. I have to be very careful doing that because, again, you don't want this scenario where he's going to give you a check and then pick up a loose rook. And right now, both rooks are undefended, but he can't do it. His king comes into the centre. Now, you're meant to have your king in the centre in the end game. Whether this is quite an end game is a bit unclear because there's so many heavy pieces, but anyway. My rooks, again, seek safety defending each other, which is glorious. Nick hoovers off an extra pawn, and we don't quite see the threat yet, but these 2 connected pawns on the queen side, if he can get one of those through, that's going to be really, really important. And so all of a sudden, he's created a new threat. I move my knight onto e6, and no, he's not going to let me fork his queen and king on c5, much as I would love to. He's not going to let that happen, but there are a lot of threats here. There's the rooks and the knight. There's lots of ways they can find to pick off a king or a queen. Well, pick off the queen. If they pick off the king, it's the end of the game. So Nick moves his pawn to cover that square on c5. He's also getting his pawns rolling. I stop his pawns rolling by putting my rook in the way. He gets his pawn, moves the other pawn to defend. I move my other rook across, can't remember why right now. The good news is my king's pretty safe. You know, my pieces are in the centre, controlling the centre, which makes my king pretty safe. Nick's queen comes across here looking for trouble, maybe looking for a check on the open g-file. Again, if the pawn was there, that would be really bad. My rook moves here, I can't remember why. he sort of forks both of my rooks, but the good news is there's two ways they can defend each other, so I'm not worried. And also that knight, look at that lovely stable knight defended by a pawn. Oh, it's so precious in the centre. I don't want him pushing his A pawn here, but at the moment I can just carve off his B pawn with check, so that's absolutely fine. He moves his king. I'm going to reroute my knight. Who knows where to? G6 maybe? Just defending my king. Knights are quite good at defending kings against queens, so that's quite it's quite nice. Again, Nick's getting his pawns rolling. He never wastes time, and so all of a sudden my king now, I'm quite worried seeing his pawns and his queen bear down on my king. Also, my rooks are tricky because if any one of them moves away, he could take the other one. So they've got to keep defending each other. So I put my knight on G6. No, he can't push his pawn to attack my knight because I just played knight E5 and fork his king and queen. His queen runs. Now if I had two moves, I'd go rook H5, rook H3, check and win his queen, but I don't have two moves. I move my king out of the way. Oh yes, because it's check. So the thing is, even if I did have two moves, one of them would have to be moving my king. Anyway, he's in check, but look how safe the king is on that square. He's really safe from checks and various trouble. Nick moves the pawn forward, so blocking my rook from cruising across like that, and also just progressing his pawns. I start pushing mine. Now this is controversial because this is the cover in front of my king, but I kind of think, well, maybe it can go all the way. Maybe move it one more square forward. It's defended by the knight. He still can't push his f pawn because I take his e pawn with check. It's a bit controversial this because I don't like moving the cover, but I need to create some threats of my own. Nick's queen goes back there, so no rooks can move. I push it. Attack it with my own rook. He's now pinning my knight, which looks frightening, but actually it's not obvious how he can exploit that pin. He can't attack the knight, except in a way that stops the pin with the pawn. I move a rook here. Again, the rook on b6 is loose, so really scared, but he can't do a check, so it's okay. Nick, starts keeping those pawns rolling, and my advantage, the computer's saying here, my advantage isn't that great. In fact, it's pretty close now. His pawns are rolling, and they could create problems. So this is a high-risk enterprise, but my basic idea is to break up his pawns around his king and get those rooks. Once those rooks and those knights get going on a completely open board, they're either going to checkmate the king or create a situation where you can win the queen. So it's double-edged. It's reducing the king's cover. It's reducing the knight's defence, but he's got to react to the fact that his pawn's attacked 3 times, and he can't take the pawn because I'll take his queen. Queen moves, attacking the rook. The rook defends its friend and attacks the pawn on b4. He's got to save that pawn, so he moves it forward so it's defended, which allows me to carve off this pawn and then attack it a second time with my rook. Now we're in the real kind of open board end game where it's very, very complicated because there are so many tactics based on the fact that the board's very open, and queens love open boards, but so do rooks. So it's really frightening. If you're playing this in a timed game, it'd be very stressful for me. I mean, chess can be stressful. Now this move, moving the king here, I can't remember all the reasoning behind this. Clearly, I mean, black can take this pawn with check, and why wouldn't you do that? He's attacked twice, he's defended once. He's never going to take it with the queen. So you take with check, why wouldn't you? King runs. Now quickly scanning the board, what you're looking for here is to pin the queen against the king, or to fork the queen and king. Knight to f3, not possible. Rook to d5, queen can take it. You know, you're looking for those sort of opportunities. You're looking to try, and then the game is just over because the pawns are nowhere near at the moment. But Nick's too good for that. I can move my pawn forward, defended by the knight. He moves his pawn forward, and those pawns are getting close now, so this is a proper threat. Computer says I'm back on top now, but in human terms, anything can happen in my view. Move my rook here. I'm not sure why. I think it's really super complicated. I think what this is really about is bullying the queen a bit, like moving the rook to f4 to attack the queen, and when she comes to d7, moving the rook to e7 to block the check and attack the queen again. Again, we've got these risks of perpetual check, and we've got these risks of forks. So the rook on f7 is loose, but that cannot be exploited. Nick moves the queen back to pin the knight. I unpin the knight. He's got no obvious checks, which is a relief. His king has got to run because there's a whole wealth of tactics here which could win the queen. but at the moment he's avoiding them all. I double, and now there's a concrete threat of rook e3, which ends the game immediately, pinning the queen against the king. His king runs, I give him a check. His king runs, I give him a check. His king runs, I give him a check. I like giving check. Cuts down his options. His king then goes to b7, and now this is a worry, because can his king shepherd the pawns through? I move my knight to d5. Now this, I'm claiming this is thematic, because, I'm claiming this is a sort of deep idea, because the idea is to centralise the pieces. Generally, in chess, one wants to centralise pieces, and because they've got more squares to move to from the centre. In the edges, they've got very few options. In the centre, they've got loads of options. Right now, all three of my pieces are in the central squares. And actually, Nick sent me a message saying, could your pieces be more centralised? And so they've just got loads of options. So there's loads of things where I check his king with a rook, and then his king goes to c6, and then I move my knight to b4, check, and win the queen. There's all these threats on the board because the pieces are centralised. Now, my big fear is perpetual check, and so it might seem natural to cluster your pieces around the king. But actually, I don't think that's right. I think the right thing to do is get them in the centre. Now, having said that, actually the engine says knight d5 is not the best move. It's very hard in these positions because it's so complex and the computers are so good. But still, black is better here. And it's hard for white to play. White just keeps those pawns rolling. Look how close they are now. And it's like if they get to the 6th rank, it's a crisis. And I'm starting to think maybe this could be a draw. But knight b4 is really scary. It's scary because it's hitting the queen, and also it's blocking off those squares on c6 and a6. And if my two rooks can only be on those two, on the two ranks, my first and second rank, so the 7 rank and the 8 rank, then it's checkmate. I mean, I know there's a little bit of manoeuvring to get there, but right now, because his own pawn is blocking him on b6, I need a rooks on the 7th and the 8th rank, and it's mate. He gives me a check. I've allowed him a check. But my king can move here, and what he does not want to do is check me on d7, because I block with a rook, pin his queen against his king. And, there may be lines. You worry if there's lines where the pawns get through, but there ain't. Nick plays his queen here, and it's a good move again. There are so many ways to lose your queen in this position. And this is a square that doesn't immediately lose the queen. I check him here, and I'm trying to manoeuvre towards this mating idea where the knight's covering those two squares, c6 and a6, and the rooks are covering the 7th and the 8th ranks. Nick moves his king there, and now I am one step from heaven, one step away, but Nick still has a move. His move is to, sorry, it just went really quickly then. His move is to, so in his one move, he attacks my rook with his king. And so now, rook to f8 will be a gross blunder because I lose a rook. So he's attacking my rook with his king. I can't quite get the mate in. Is there a good square for the rook to move to? There is, because if it moves to g7, it attacks his queen. The queen has to move, and now I'm threatening rook f8 with checkmate. Now, one last look. Does he have any checks? No. All the checking squares he can move to are covered. So c2 is covered by the knight. He can check me by taking the rook on g7, but then he's lost his queen, and he can't get those pawns through, which one has to check. He can check me on e4, but I just take it with a rook. So he's got no checks. His queen's attacked. I'm threatening checkmate on f8. So very gallantly and modestly, he makes a joke move, queen a8, to show that the game is over. I mean, he could have resigned, but he just wanted to do something funny, I think. Queen a8, and now rook to f8 is checkmate. And if it wasn't checkmate, it would lose the queen. So it's a really enjoyable game, and I think it's a real privilege to play against such a good player in such an interesting tournament. But also, it was an interesting endgame, because with that mix of material on those two threatening queenside pawns, it was a real test.